If you earn $83,000 a year and still feel one broken transmission away from panic, I am not going to insult you by saying you forgot to pack lunch. I am going to tell you something harsher. You are trying to live a middle-class life on a road where the toll booths multiplied faster than your paycheck. That is the real story. Most people think poverty is a hole at the bottom. I think that is dangerously outdated. In modern America, the more important danger is the toll road in the middle. It is the stretch where you make too much to be treated as poor, too little to buy real margin, and just enough to keep paying for the right to remain a functional adult in the system. That is where millions of families live. That is where fear gets dressed up as normal life. That is where the car repair becomes a crisis, the rent increase becomes a family argument, the medical bill becomes a week of pretending not to look at the mailbox, and the phrase doing okay becomes one of the great accounting frauds of modern life. I have spent my life looking at cash flows. I look at businesses that appear strong and ask one question before all others. What has to go right for this machine to keep running? You should do the same thing with your own household, because a lot of families who believe they are secure are not secure at all. They are simply still moving through the toll lane, and movement is not the same thing as safety. The first mistake people make is confusing income with control. A paycheck is not control. A paycheck is just raw fuel. Control is what remains after the tolls. You can earn a respectable number on paper and still have almost no control over your life if every major dollar has already been preclaimed by housing, transportation, insurance, childcare, taxes, and the other silent collectors standing by the roadside with their hands out. That is why the median household income can sound respectable and feel fragile at the same time. The number says middle class. The nervous system says one surprise away from damage. When those two things disagree, I trust the nervous system, because your body usually discovers the truth before policy does. If you want to understand what happened to the American middle, stop using the old vocabulary. Stop asking who is poor and who is comfortable as if those are the only two buckets that matter. The more useful question is this: how many toll gates stand between a household and actual stability? Now start counting. Take a family making around $83,000 a year on paper. That sounds like the old promise: a house, a car, maybe two. Children, a vacation that does not require a credit card hangover. Some savings, some breathing room. Now drag that fantasy into arithmetic. After federal taxes, payroll taxes, and often state taxes, that family is not dealing with $83,000 anymore. It is dealing with something in the mid-60s. That is your real fuel tank. Now comes the first toll gate: housing. This is where a huge amount of public conversation still sounds like it was written in another century. People talk about housing as if it were still one expense among many. It is not for millions of families. It is the dominant collector on the road. If you rent in a major city, the check is vicious. If you own with a mortgage in a high-cost state, the check is vicious in a more respectable outfit. Either way, a massive amount of the tank is gone before life has even started. Then comes transportation. This one is particularly cruel because it hides inside culture. America built a labor market around cars, and then pretended cars were lifestyle choices. For a huge share of households, they are not choices. They are admission tickets. You do not get to work without them. You do not keep the income that pays the mortgage without them. So fuel, insurance, maintenance, registration, repairs, financing, maybe two vehicles instead of one, and suddenly the second toll gate takes another bite out of the tank. Then comes health care, which is one of the finest examples of how a country can normalize financial abrasion. A lot of households hear that their employer covers most of the premium and feel lucky, but the worker contribution is still real money. Then come deductibles, then co-pays. Then the strange and exhausting game of paying a large amount for the privilege of still being afraid to use the thing you paid for. Then comes child care. This is where the illusion breaks for many families. Not because child care is frivolous, because it is the opposite. It is one of the least optional expenses in the entire system. Two incomes are often required to carry the toll road. Child care is what allows the second income to exist. But child care itself can be so expensive that the second income starts to look like a relay race where one runner is carrying the other on his back. This is how a family can make the median income and still run a negative emotional balance all month long. It is not that groceries are free and luxuries are the problem. It is that the core machine can eat almost everything before food, utilities, school costs, clothing, medicine, repairs, and savings even show up. That is not a lifestyle issue. That is a systems issue. And this is why so many households can do everything they were told to do and still feel like they are underwater while technically standing upright. People looking in from a distance say they earn a decent income. The household itself says that after housing, transportation, health care, and child care, the money is gone before groceries, utilities, repairs, clothing, school needs, birthdays, insurance, shocks, and savings even begin. That is not luxury. That is not irresponsibility. That is what I call the middle-class toll road. You are not spending on extravagance. You are spending on permission. Permission to sleep indoors, permission to get to work, permission to leave children somewhere safe enough to keep working, permission to not go medically bankrupt too quickly, permission to remain legible to the economy. Now ask yourself a very Buffett question. If you owned a business where nearly all the major expenses were fixed, contractual, and rising faster than sales, would you call that business robust? Of course not. You would call it fragile. You would say it had a weak margin of safety. You would say one shock could break the model. Then why do so many households accept that structure in their own lives and still call it normal? Because the outer scorecard is louder than the inner one. The outer scorecard says if the salary sounds respectable, the life must be respectable. The inner scorecard asks how many months of breathing room are actually left after the toll booths collect their share. The outer scorecard loves status. The inner scorecard loves resilience. The outer scorecard asks how you look. The inner scorecard asks how easily you break. And this is where the psychological damage begins. The first damage is shame. A family looks at a respectable top-line income and cannot reconcile it with constant tightness. So they assume the fault must be moral. They tell themselves they are disorganized, undisciplined, too weak, too indulgent. But shame is often what a system produces when it wants to hide structure inside personal failure. The second damage is mental compression. When too much of your income is already spoken for, every surprise becomes strategic. There is no easy adjustment. There is only triage. You are not making long-term decisions anymore. You are performing roadside repairs while traffic is still moving. That environment changes the mind. It narrows time. It makes a week feel like a quarter and a quarter feel like a lifetime. It turns future planning into a luxury product. That is why financial stress is so corrosive. It does not merely shrink the bank account. It shrinks the planning horizon, and when the planning horizon shrinks, your life starts being governed by urgency instead of design. The third damage is that it destroys refusal power. I use that phrase a lot because it is one of the true dividing lines in financial life. Refusal power is the ability to say no without immediately injuring yourself, no to a bad boss, no to a rent increase you cannot absorb, no to moving to a worse neighborhood, no to a debt product built to feast on urgency, no to work that is hollowing you out, no to panic. The toll road strips that power first. It leaves you technically employed, technically housed, technically insured, technically functioning, and yet strategically trapped. That is why I do not measure financial condition by whether a household is still moving. I measure it by whether it can refuse. Now let me show you the deeper absurdity. The public benchmark used to decide who is poor and who is not still carries the ghost of another America. It was built in a world where food took up a much bigger share of the family budget. You could estimate a minimal food cost, multiply it, and get something closer to real deprivation. Back then, that logic had some relationship to the structure of household expenses. Back then, housing was cheaper relative to income. Healthcare was not the same monster. College was not the same monster. Childcare was not yet a giant commercial gatekeeper. One parent at home was more common. A summer job could still carry more weight. That world is gone. Today, food is not the tyrant of the budget. Housing is, healthcare is, childcare is, transportation is, insurance is. The old poverty line still whispers with the assumptions of an economy where the main question was whether you could afford enough food. The modern question is whether you can afford enough participation. That is a very different calculation. I call the old threshold the ghost line. It still stands there in policy language. It still decides access. It still shapes public discussion. But it no longer describes what a stable life costs. That is why a family can earn more than double the official poverty line and still feel like stability is a rumor told by older people. The ghost line says you are fine. The toll road says pay again. And if you update the old logic to something closer to the modern cost structure, the number starts looking much larger. Not because everyone suddenly became poor, because the price of participation broke away from the benchmark and never looked back. That split matters more than most people realize, because public numbers do not just describe reality. They authorize how much pain society is willing to acknowledge. If the benchmark is too low, then millions of households vanish into a statistical blind spot. They are not counted as poor enough to trigger alarm. They are not comfortable enough to build margin. They live in the gap. The gap is where danger becomes invisible. And invisible danger is always the best kind for a broken system. You can see the cruelty even more clearly when a family climbs the wage ladder. This is where most people assume the story gets better in a straight line. Work more, earn more, breathe easier. That is the mythology. The toll road does not work that way, because assistance often shuts off at one gate, while market pricing is still waiting several miles ahead. So a raise arrives and is celebrated for one evening, then one benefit disappears. Another threshold is crossed. Another subsidy falls away. A few more dollars an hour show up on paper, and a much larger amount of net support disappears in practice. That is not a ladder. That is a disguised cliff. I call it the ladder trap. The climb looks rational from a distance. Up close, certain rungs are greased. You step higher and end up with less usable life. That is one of the quietest brutalities in the system. The person did exactly what the moral script demanded, worked more, improved income, moved forward, and still got hit with a net setback. Once you understand that, you begin to see why so many households live in permanent caution. They are not lazy. They are not broken. They are making decisions in a maze where some wins are secretly losses. This has consequences far beyond monthly stress. It changes the architecture of a life. People delay children because the toll road makes family expansion feel like financial self. They delay homeownership because the down payment, the interest rate, the insurance, the taxes, and the maintenance turn what used to be a base into a dare. They avoid switching jobs because losing employer health coverage for even a short period can be catastrophic. They do not start businesses because entrepreneurship sounds romantic until you realize you are one bad quarter away from losing the very coverage and cash flow that keeps the household above water. They do not move to better opportunities because the rent near those opportunities has already been bid into another class of reality. This is how a nation can still talk in the language of mobility while quietly taxing motion itself. You want to know something revealing? For a short period during the pandemic, a lot of toll booths suddenly went quiet. Commuting stopped. Daily fuel burns stopped. Work lunches stopped. Dry cleaning stopped. Some child care costs disappeared. Some friction vanished. Stimulus mattered, yes. But so did the sudden removal of the daily tolls required simply to show up. And what happened? Savings surged. That is not a trivial observation. It is a confession written by the economy itself. When a large number of households stopped paying the participation toll, they immediately looked more solvent. Not because they had been secretly wasteful, because the road had been charging them for breath. Then the world reopened. And the booths came back, not just back. Hungrier, mortgage rates climbed, insurance climbed. Health costs climbed, home affordability collapsed in places that once felt normal, and all of that landed on a public narrative that kept saying incomes were rising and households were, on aggregate, better off. This is how official optimism can become a form of gaslighting. The spreadsheet sees progress, The kitchen table sees compression. I am not against data. I built a life on respecting it. But data without structure is one of the easiest ways to lie, honestly. If you only look at the share of households crossing some higher income threshold, you might conclude the middle is shrinking because people are getting richer. Sometimes the truth is uglier. The middle can shrink because the price of a merely stable life has run upward faster than the language used to describe it. In other words, you are not graduating into prosperity. The admissions office just raised the tuition for normal. That is the machine, and once you see it, a lot of false advice becomes obvious. When someone tells a household trapped on the toll road to just cut discretionary spending, that can be useful at the edges, but it misses the core. The core is fixed. Cost gravity. The core is the fact that many of the largest drains are not impulse buys, they are structural tickets. The car is not an Instagram indulgence. It is often the bridge to employment. Lifestyle is not a vanity. It is a toll you pay to preserve the second income that keeps the first income from being overwhelmed. The housing bill is not a little treat. It is the largest collector on the route. That is why shallow budgeting advice so often feels insulting. It is trying to fix a toll system with coupon discipline. Now let me make this even more personal. There are two scorecards you can keep in your financial life. One is the outer scorecard that one asks whether your income sounds impressive, whether your zip code sounds respectable, whether your job title translates well at dinner, whether your children attend the right school, whether your car looks like you have arrived, whether your house proves a certain status story. The outer scorecard loves the toll road because the toll road sells social legitimacy. You pay, and in return you get to look like you belong. The other is the inner scorecard. That one asks a different question. How many months can you absorb without panic? How much of your life is spoken for before the month even starts? How many decisions are truly yours? How much refusal power do you have? How exposed are you to one layoff, one diagnosis, one rate reset, one insurance spike, one child care shift, one transmission, one lease renewal? The outer scorecard says $83,000 or $150,000 sounds decent. The inner scorecard asks how much open road remains after the booths. That is the scorecard I trust. Always, because appearance can survive on leverage denial and calendar luck, freedom cannot. If you want my blunt diagnosis, modern financial fragility is no longer confined to the bottom. It is spreading through the center. Not always as visible poverty, as managed instability, as polished strain, as respectable vulnerability, as households that can still make every payment until the first month they cannot. That is why I do not think the real divide is rich versus poor. The more revealing divide is between households with margin and households without it. Margin is the most underrated financial asset in the world. Margin is not excess, it is oxygen. Margin is what lets a family absorb life without financing the shock. Margin is what turns a surprise from a crisis into an inconvenience. Margin is what lets you wait for a better opportunity instead of taking the first ugly one. Margin is what keeps one mistake from cascading through the entire structure. On the toll road, margin is the first casualty, and here is the part that should make you angry. A lot of political and cultural language still treats the absence of margin as an individual failure, as if millions of families all spontaneously became sloppy at the same time, as if the collapse of breathing room were mainly the product of weak character. When housing outruns wages for long enough, when health costs outrun inflation for long enough, when child care behaves like a second mortgage, when transportation remains mandatory and expensive, when policy thresholds lag reality, and when benefits vanish before market pricing becomes survivable, you do not have a moral epidemic, you have a systems problem. And systems problems require systems thinking. That brings me to the part most people skip, the escape path. I am not going to pretend there is a magical trick that dissolves the toll road. There is not. But there are strategic moves that matter, and they matter precisely because the system is real. First, stop lying to yourself with gross income. Gross income is vanity. Net controllable cash flow is reality. You need a toll map, not a hopeful budget. A toll map, you need to know exactly which gates are structural, which are negotiable, which are temporary, and which are traps masquerading as adulthood. When I study a business, I separate essential operating costs from ego costs, financing errors, and hidden leakages. You should do the same. A household that does not know its toll map is not budgeting, it is guessing. Second, build what I call a refusal fund before you obsess over appearance. Most people say emergency fund. That is fine, but I prefer refusal fund because it names the true function. This cash is not just for emergencies. It is there to buy decision, making time. It is there. So the next surprise does not immediately recruit debt. It is there so you do not need to say yes to every rotten option the moment something goes wrong. A refusal fund is how you begin reclaiming power from the toll road. Third, attack fixed costs with more seriousness than you attack lattes. The world loves to shame tiny consumption because it is easier than confronting the larger machinery. But the biggest gains often come from the big gates: housing choices, car choices, commute geometry, insurance shopping, child care coordination, school district trade-offs, job location trade-offs. These are not sexy decisions. They are capital allocation decisions. And capital allocation is where fortunes are really made or protected. Fourth, do not voluntarily add new toll booths in the name of status. This is one of the great middle class self-inflictions: a larger house than you need, a car payment designed to win social silence, a neighborhood purchase for symbolic reasons, activities that convert your children into line items of competitive signaling. You tell yourself these are signs of progress. Often they are just future gates you are installing with your own hands. Status is expensive because it rarely ends with a purchase. It reproduces. It creates maintenance, comparison expectation, social obligation. Once status enters the household budget, it behaves like a toll operator with expansion plans. Fifth, increase income, but do it with your eyes open. Income still matters enormously. You cannot solve a structural squeeze on grit alone, but extra income is only liberation if it outruns the next wave of fixed costs. If every raise immediately gets consumed by a nicer zip code, a more impressive car, more financed identity, and more participation pressure, then income growth becomes motion without escape velocity. You must decide in advance what each raise will do. Otherwise, the road decides for you. Sixth, protect your ability to move. The toll road punishes rigidity. Skills that travel matter, credentials that travel matter, networks that travel matter, savings that travel matter. A household that cannot move geographically, professionally, or psychologically is far more exposed than it looks. Mobility is not just ambition, it is a hedge. Seventh, teach children the difference between a life that looks expensive and a life that is actually durable. A lot of families quietly pass on outer scorecard thinking because they themselves were raised inside scarcity and now want visible proof that the scarcity ended. I understand the impulse, but if you teach children to measure success by the size of the tolls they can afford, you are teaching them a very elegant form of bondage. Teach them margin. Teach them optionality. Teach them that the strongest life is not the one with the loudest payments. It is the one that can absorb bad weather without begging. Now, let me say something even tougher. You do not need the official poverty line to validate your strain. You do not need a government chart to tell you whether your life has enough room. You do not need permission to admit that an income can be respectable and still strategically weak. The benchmark matters for policy, but your household cannot afford to outsource reality to a benchmark built for another era. If the numbers say you should feel okay, but your life says otherwise, believe your life, then improve the structure. The great danger is not just that the public measure is outdated. The greater danger is that you let an outdated measure talk you out of making necessary changes. That is how families stay trapped. They keep waiting to feel rich enough, according to public language, before they act like stewards. Do not do that. Act like a steward. Now map the road now. Cut the fake gates now. Build refusal power now. Buy margin now. Defend flexibility now, because the toll road does not announce when it is about to hurt you. It simply keeps collecting until the day a surprise arrives and exposes what was always true. I have watched investors ruin themselves by focusing on reported earnings while ignoring cash drains hidden in the structure. I have watched businesses celebrate revenue growth while dying from bad economics, one contract at a time. Households do the same thing. They celebrate salary, they celebrate the move, they celebrate the title, they celebrate the house, they celebrate the appearance of entry into a class. And all the while the underlying economics worsen. Do not confuse entry with ownership. Do not confuse motion with safety. Do not confuse decent income with durable finances. Do not confuse policy definitions with lived truth. And above all, do not confuse the ability to pay the toll today with the ability to build a free life tomorrow, because those are not the same project. One is survival with makeup, the other is strategy. I want you to picture two families. Both earn enough to look respectable from across the street. The first family keeps feeding the toll road because every next payment feels normal enough. They keep the right image, they keep the right neighborhood story, they keep the right school story, they keep the right consumption story. They remain functional, admired, and privately brittle. One day a shock hits, and everyone acts surprised. The second family decides that appearing successful is a cheap substitute for being hard to break. They downgrade a gate where they can, they refuse a status purchase, they build a refusal fund, they study fixed costs like an operator, they keep raises from becoming new obligations, they protect mobility. From the outside they may look slightly behind, from the inside they are buying oxygen. 10 years later, the gap is enormous. Not because one family learned a clever trick, because one family kept paying for the right to be seen, and the other family paid for the right to choose. That is the real fork in the road. Not rich or poor, not homeowner or renter, not even saver or spender. The deeper split is this. Are you using your life to finance tolls, or are you using your decisions to reduce them? That is the test. That is the mirror. That is the door. And you need to choose before the next booth rises in front of you, because it always does. The road is not getting cheaper by accident. The collectors are not going to grow generous because you are tired. The ghost line is not going to save you. The outer scorecard is not going to protect your children. The appearance of normal is not going to keep your life from breaking. Only structure will do that. Only margin will do that. Only refusal power will do that. So here is a choice I would leave you with if you were sitting across the table from me. You can keep proving that you belong on the road, or you can start building a life that needs fewer toll booths to feel whole. One path gives you status on borrowed oxygen. The other gives you a smaller audience and a stronger spine. One path keeps asking, how do I keep up? The other asks, how do I become difficult to shake? One path ends with a household that looks fine until the day it isn't. The other ends with something much rarer, a life that can absorb reality without asking permission. If you want a real middle-class future, stop worshiping the income number and start defending the open road. Because the next decade will not be won by the family that earns the most on paper. It will be won by the family that learns how to keep more of its life after the tolls.